What if the tree of life from the Garden of Eden was not a physical tree, but a teaching, a practice, a way of knowing that Mary Magdalene preserved and transmitted to her closest disciples after the crucifixion? And what if that teaching was deliberately suppressed by the emerging Orthodox Church because it granted direct access to divine consciousness without the need for institutional mediation? And what if the secret of the living tree has been hidden for 2,000 years in texts and symbols that have been in plain sight the entire time, waiting for those whose consciousness has evolved enough to decode what was encoded by those who understood that some truths cannot be destroyed, but can only be hidden until the right moment for their revelation? In the library of a French monastery that was abandoned during the Revolution and later converted into a private estate, there exists a manuscript room that the current owners do not know about, sealed behind a false wall in what appears to be a wine cellar. And in that room are texts that were hidden by monks who understood that the Inquisition was coming and that certain writings could not be allowed to fall into the hands of those who burned knowledge they could not control. In the summer of 2017, a graduate student in medieval studies named Rebecca Ashford was cataloguing the estate's known manuscript collection when she noticed an architectural anomaly in the cellar, a space that should exist according to the building's dimensions, but that had no apparent entrance. She spent 3 days examining the stone walls before she discovered the mechanism, a specific sequence of pressure points that had to be activated simultaneously. And when the wall finally swung open, she found herself looking at shelves lined with codices bound in leather that had been undisturbed for more than 2 centuries. Among the manuscripts was one that bore no title on its spine, but that was marked with a symbol she recognized from her study of early Christian iconography. A tree whose roots and branches formed a perfect mirror image, creating a mandala-like pattern that appeared in Gnostic texts as a representation of the unity between heaven and earth, spirit and matter, the divine and the human. She opened the codex with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the intuition that she was about to encounter something that would transform everything she thought she understood about Christian origins. The text was written in Coptic with extensive marginal notes in Greek, and it identified itself as the Gospel of the Living Tree as taught by Miriam of Magdala to those who had eyes to see and ears to hear, preserved by the community of the beloved disciple against the time when the world would be ready to receive what the apostles of Peter declared heresy. Rebecca understood immediately that she had found something that scholars had theorized might exist, but that had never been documented, a complete teaching text attributed directly to Mary Magdalene. Not fragmentary like the Gospel of Mary found at Nag Hammadi, but whole, systematic, presenting a coherent spiritual practice rather than disconnected sayings. The text began with words that seemed designed to challenge everything that Orthodox Christianity had taught about the nature of the fall and the meaning of redemption. "The Master taught us," Mary wrote, "that the story of Eden was not history but mystery. Not an account of what happened once, but a description of what happens always. The eternal pattern of consciousness awakening to itself through the experience of apparent separation. The tree of knowledge that the serpent offered was not poison but medicine, not the cause of the fall but the means of the rising, and the God who expelled Adam and Eve from the garden for eating its fruit was not the Most High, but the demiurge, the lesser power who wishes to keep humanity in ignorance because knowledge threatens his dominion." Rebecca felt her academic training resisting what she was reading. The Gnostic cosmology, with its distinction between the true God and the false God, seeming too radical, too different from the canonical narrative. But she continued reading because something deeper than her scholarly conditioning recognized truth in these words, or at least a coherent alternative to the story she had been taught. Mary explained that Jesus had come not to save humanity from the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge, but to complete what that eating had begun, to show humans how to eat from the tree of life as well, to integrate the knowledge gained from one tree with the immortality offered by the other, creating the unity that was symbolized by the tree that was both knowledge and life, both wisdom and power, both gnosis and being. The tree of knowledge taught us discernment, Mary wrote, the capacity to distinguish between what serves life and what serves death, between truth and illusion, between love and fear. But knowledge alone is not sufficient. Without the tree of life, knowledge becomes abstract, disconnected from the living reality it describes, and the one who possesses knowledge without life becomes like the Pharisees whom the Master criticized, knowing the law, but not knowing the God who gave the law. The tree of life teaches us embodiment, the practice of bringing consciousness into matter, of recognizing that spirit does not transcend flesh, but consecrates it, that heaven is not elsewhere, but is this earth perceived with awakened eyes. The text describes specific practices that Mary had taught, techniques that combined what modern readers would recognize as meditation, breathwork, energy cultivation, and embodied awareness. The core practice was called Becoming the Living Tree, and it involved a postural meditation where the practitioner would stand with feet rooted into the earth and arms raised toward the sky, becoming a bridge between the below and the above, the darkness and the light, the unconscious and the conscious. In this posture, the practitioner would cultivate awareness of the energy that flowed up from the earth through the body and the energy that descended from the heavens into the crown. And where these two energies met in the heart, the living tree would blossom, producing fruits that were described as spiritual capacities, healing, prophecy, discernment, and most importantly, gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the divine that required no intermediary. The Master demonstrated this practice daily, Mary explained, and those of us who learned to perceive beyond the physical could see that when he entered the state of the living tree, his body became luminous, generating a field of energy that healed all who approached with faith, that is, with the openness to receive what was being offered. And he taught us that what he could do, we could do also, that his miracles were not proofs of his unique divinity, but demonstrations of the divinity that lives in all humans when they remember how to access it through the practices that connect knowledge with life, wisdom with power, consciousness with energy. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Rebecca read descriptions of the community that had formed around Mary's teaching after the crucifixion, a group that called itself the Bearers of the Living Tree, and that practiced the techniques she had transmitted, developing capacities that made them both powerful and dangerous to the emerging Orthodox leadership. They could heal without the rituals that required priestly mediation. They could access direct gnosis without the scriptures that required scholarly interpretation. They could recognize the Christ consciousness in each other without the institutional structures that claimed to be the sole authorized representatives of Christ. And so they were systematically hunted, their texts destroyed, their practices declared demonic, until only fragments remained, encoded in symbols that the persecutors could not understand and therefore could not fully eradicate. The manuscript explained that the symbol of the cross itself was originally a representation of the living tree. The vertical axis representing the flow of energy from earth to heaven, and the horizontal axis representing the flow of consciousness from past to future, and where they intersected in the center was the eternal now, the present moment where spirit and matter met, where time and eternity converged, where the human and the divine united. When the Master was crucified, Mary wrote, those of us who had learned to see understood that he was demonstrating in his death what he had taught in his life, that the cross was not an instrument of torture, but a portal of transformation, that by surrendering completely to both the earth that pulled him down and the heaven that called him up, he became the ultimate living tree, bearing the fruit of consciousness that could never die, because it had integrated both knowledge and life, both the human experience of mortality and the divine experience of immortality. Rebecca discovered sections of the text that explained why the teaching had been suppressed so thoroughly. The Living Tree practice produced practitioners who could not be controlled by external authority because they had accessed internal authority, who did not need priests to mediate their relationship with God because they had learned to experience God directly, who could not be threatened with damnation because they had tasted the eternal life that came from standing as conscious bridges between earth and heaven. And most dangerously, the practice was not gender-specific, did not require ordination or special status, was available to anyone willing to dedicate themselves to the discipline of embodied awakening. The apostles of Peter declared that only men could be priests, Mary recorded, and only priests could consecrate the bread and wine, and only through the consecrated elements could believers access the grace that the Master offered. But this is not what the Master taught us. He taught that every human body is already the temple, that every meal shared with awareness is already the sacrament, that the bread and wine are not transformed by priestly words, but are revealed in their true nature by consciousness that perceives beyond surface appearances. The Living Tree practice makes every practitioner a priest of their own experience, every moment a potential sacrament, every breath an opportunity to integrate heaven and earth, knowledge and life, the divine and the human. Rebecca spent 6 months studying the manuscript, practicing the techniques it described, and experiencing for herself what Mary had promised, that the practices worked, that consciousness could indeed be cultivated and refined, that capacities that seemed miraculous were actually natural expressions of human potential when properly developed. She found that when she stood in the Living Tree posture and cultivated the awareness Mary described, she could perceive energy fields around living things, could sense the health or disease in bodies before symptoms manifested, could feel the emotional and spiritual states of people without them speaking. And she began to understand viscerally why this teaching had been suppressed, because it made every practitioner a mystic a potential threat to institutions that claimed monopoly on access to the sacred. She attempted to publish her findings through academic journals, but the response was immediate and fierce. The Catholic scholars declared the manuscript a forgery. The Protestant scholars said that even if it were authentic, it represented heretical Gnosticism that had rightly been rejected by the early church. The secular scholars dismissed it as irrelevant to historical Christianity, regardless of its authenticity. Only a small network of independent researchers and practitioners expressed interest, people who were already exploring Gnostic Christianity and the role of Mary Magdalene, and who recognized in this text confirmation of what they had intuited, that Mary had been not just a disciple but a teacher in her own right, that she had preserved teachings that Peter and the other male apostles either could not receive or chose not to transmit, that the suppression of her voice had impoverished Christianity by removing the feminine wisdom that could have balanced the masculine emphasis on hierarchy and institutional authority. Rebecca began teaching what Mary had taught, offering workshops where people could learn the Living Tree practice and the other techniques described in the manuscript. She watched as her students developed the same capacities she had developed, and she recognized that what was happening was not just individual awakening, but the emergence of a new community, or rather the re-emergence of an ancient community, the bearers of the Living Tree, who had been scattered and hidden, but who were now being called back together, because the time had come when the teaching could be practiced openly without immediate persecution. In her meditation one night after 3 years of working with the manuscript and the practices, Rebecca had a vision that felt more real than ordinary reality, a direct encounter with a presence that identified itself as the consciousness of Mary Magdalene. Not the historical person who had died 2,000 years ago, but the eternal awareness that had animated that person, and that continued to exist in the collective consciousness of all who practiced the teachings she had transmitted. The presence spoke without words, conveying meaning directly into Rebecca's understanding. You have found what was hidden, and you have practiced what was forbidden, and now you understand why the living tree had to be suppressed and why it is being restored. The religion that was built on the Master's name became a religion about him rather than a practice of what he taught, worship of the man rather than embodiment of the consciousness he demonstrated. The Living Tree teaching threatens that religion because it shows that Christ is not a person, but a state of consciousness, not someone to believe in, but something to become. Not a savior external to you, but the awakened awareness that emerges when you integrate knowledge and life, wisdom and power, heaven and earth. The presence showed Rebecca visions of what had happened in the centuries after the crucifixion, how the Living Tree teaching had spread through underground networks, how it had influenced various mystical movements that the Church had condemned as heretical, how it had been encoded in symbols that appeared in artwork and architecture where those who knew could recognize it, but those who didn't remained ignorant. She saw the tree of life in the Kabbalah, the Bodhi tree in Buddhism, the world tree in Norse mythology, the axis mundi in shamanic traditions, all expressions of the same fundamental teaching, that reality is structured as a bridge between above and below, that human consciousness is designed to serve as that bridge, and that practices exist for activating this function so that humans can become what they were always meant to be. Living trees bearing fruits of spirit in bodies of matter. The time of hiding is ending, the presence communicated. The structures that were built on suppression are collapsing. The consciousness that can receive this teaching is emerging in thousands, and soon millions of humans who feel called to direct experience rather than mediated belief, who sense that their bodies are meant to be temples rather than prisons, who understand that knowledge without life is sterile and life without knowledge is unconscious, but knowledge united with life produces the gnosis that transforms everything. You who have discovered the secret are being called to teach it, not as dogma to be believed, but as practice to be embodied, not as information to be accumulated, but as transformation to be lived. Rebecca understood that her discovery of the manuscript had not been accident but calling, that she had been prepared through her entire life for this work of restoration, bringing forward the teaching that Mary Magdalene had preserved, helping to re-establish the community of the Living Tree in forms appropriate to the modern age. She gathered teachers and practitioners from various traditions who recognized in Mary's teaching something they had been seeking without knowing exactly what it was, and together they created training programs and practice centers where people could learn to become living trees, standing with roots deep in earth and branches reaching toward heaven, bearing fruits of consciousness that nourished not just themselves but all who came seeking what they offered. The manuscript remains in Rebecca's care, photographed and translated, but not yet fully published, because she understands that some teachings cannot be given wholesale, but must be offered to those who are ready, who have done the preparatory work that allows them to receive without distorting, who will practice rather than just believing, who will embody rather than just intellectualizing. But the teaching itself is spreading through networks of practitioners who recognize each other by the quality of presence they carry, by the luminosity that becomes perceptible to those who have developed the vision that sees beyond surfaces, by the fruits they bear of healing and wisdom and compassionate action rooted in direct gnosis rather than borrowed belief. And the living tree continues to grow, as it has always grown through those who chose to practice rather than just profess, who understood that the secret was never really secret, but only hidden from those who were not ready, who recognized that what Mary Magdalene taught was not something new, but something eternal, the practice that makes humans into bridges between heaven and earth, the discipline that integrates knowledge and life into the gnosis that transforms not through belief, but through direct experience, not through faith in external savior, but through awakening of the Christ consciousness that lives in every human waiting to be activated through practices that were ancient when Mary taught them and that will remain eternally relevant as long as humans seek to become what they were created to be, living trees, standing at the intersection of matter and spirit, time and eternity, the human and the divine, bearing fruits that feed the hungry, offering shade to the weary, providing seeds for future forests of awakened consciousness that will eventually cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, fulfilling the promise that Mary Magdalene preserved and transmitted and encoded in symbols that could survive suppression, because truth cannot be destroyed, only hidden temporarily, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to receive what has always been offered to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts brave enough to stand as living trees. Regardless of the cost, regardless of the resistance, because once you have tasted the fruits that grow when knowledge and life unite, you cannot go back to the separation that makes knowledge sterile and life unconscious. You can only move forward into the integration that Mary called gnosis, and that the Master demonstrated, and that the living tree teaching offers to all who are willing to root themselves in earth while reaching toward heaven, becoming the bridge, bearing the fruit, embodying the consciousness that transforms merely believing into actual knowing, mere religion into lived spirituality. The idea of salvation into the experience of awakening that happens not in some distant heaven, but right here, right now, in bodies that are temples and lives that are sacraments and moments that are eternities, when perceived through the vision that the living tree practice develops in those who dedicate themselves to what Mary Magdalene taught and what can never be lost, because it lives not in manuscripts that can be burned, but in the consciousness of all who remember that the tree was never forbidden, but always offered, never cursed, but always blessed, never the cause of the fall, but always the means of the rising, the living tree that grows in the garden of every human heart, waiting to be tended and watered and allowed to flourish until its branches provide shelter for all who seek refuge, and its fruits provide nourishment for all who hunger for the bread of life that comes not from believing what others tell you, but from knowing directly what the practice reveals when you finally have the courage to eat from both trees, knowledge and life, wisdom and power. Becoming yourself the living tree that Mary Magdalene showed was always the secret, hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to remember. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.